As you have heard on Bridge City News, the Alberta budget is out and many are feeling the effects either positively, like the trades, or negatively, like the public sector workers. To talk more about it and what's in store for our province is the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Welcome back to BCN, Tyler.
Thanks for having me on.
So overall, we're looking at reductions of 2.8% over the next 4 years, and that should theoretically help balance the books by 2022, 2023?
Yeah, that's the plan. By the time the next election rolls around, we should be out of a deficit. So, as you said, 2.8% cuts, and that's spread over those 4 years. So it's not 2.8% cuts each year, adding up to 12 and a bit or whatever that might come out to. So, not as deep of cuts perhaps as some were afraid of. Perhaps not as deep as some were hoping, if critics to the right of this government, and certainly nowhere near as deep as what Ralph Klein put Albertans through in the sort of mid 1990s.
Now, even with the UCP cuts, you're saying that it will not substantially bring down the debt with those cuts?
Yeah, it's sort of an odd thing, and we were all sitting last week looking at the budget documents and talking to the finance minister, and someone pointed out that, gosh, your final number is 93 billion, and the final number that the NDP had proposed was going to be 97 billion, give or take. So, we're about $4 billion below what the threshold or what the NDP debt might have been, which that's a lot of money, but perhaps in the overall scheme of government is not an enormous chunk of change. Now, what the finance minister has said is that, of course, you can't really start slaying the debt until you're back to balance. So the plan is to get back to balance over the next few years, and then it will be time to tackle the debt. But it was reporters were a little bit sort of blindsided in the room last week, and people going, what the heck's going on? I thought we were going to be getting rid of the debt and stuff. So, but that is sort of the longer term plan, of course.
Now, with this budget, there's actually some good news for those who are wanting to go into the trades.
There are, yeah. There's millions of dollars available for grant programs and help, things like that. There's one specifically for women in the trades. I think it's about $2 million. So the trades are getting a boost here, that's for sure. I think the other thing that this budget is maybe not getting as much credit for as it deserves is this is actually a credible path to balance. There have been no shortage of economists and political scientists who criticized this government over the past 6 or 8 months. But sort of the agreement here seems to be that this is a path that will take Alberta back into the black. Now, you can quibble about where those cuts are being made, where there's some revenues being gained, what programs are being cut, what programs are being maintained. You can fight over all of those things. But I think it's important to remember that the baseline fact of the matter is this is a credible path to get to a balanced budget in the next 4 years.
Now, Tyler, we've been hearing from the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees and Susan Slade, and they're not too happy.
No, there are a lot of folks who aren't especially happy. A lot of the public sector unions are going into wage negotiations and bargaining over the next little while. A lot of those agreements come due next year. The province just said they're going to be looking at a 2% wage rollback, as a matter of fact, as opposed to just a freeze on some provincial employees. And they are also looking at cutting the size of the civil service by about 800 people, give or take. The numbers of actual employees was a little bit unclear over the past week, to be honest with you. But at any rate, cutting a few $100 million by eliminating those employees. Now, in theory, that's supposed to come from attrition, early retirements, things like that, as opposed to actual layoffs. But there's little doubt that teachers, that public servants, that bureaucrats of all types really are a little bit on edge about this. And frankly, that's always the way it is to some extent with a government that's promising any measure of austerity. You saw the same thing under Stephen Harper in Ottawa for a long, long time, and I don't think it's a huge surprise that people in the public sector are ticked off right now.
And what's interesting too is the Finance Minister Travis Toews says, when it comes to the budget, public sector workers make up 53% of our budget. So it's a big part of what we're talking about here. Now, how will the budget impact post-secondary students in our province?
Yeah, that was one of the maybe more surprising things that came out of it. So probably the big one is that the government has decided to lift a tuition freeze. And so that means that tuition can go up by about 7% per year, which is, I believe it'll be the first increase in a number of years. So maybe it'll have caught up to inflation, that kind of thing. But certainly That was a bit of a shocker. And there's also the elimination of some grant programs or tax credit programs, I should say, um, which also will affect post-secondary students. And then perhaps one of the other things it was there were so many things that happened in this budget. It was hard to keep track of them all in the days right afterwards. And another one was that the STEP program has been eliminated. That was a temporary summer employment program for students that probably many viewers of a certain age will remember taking advantage of. So there are a bunch of changes in there for post-secondary, and it's certainly, you know, part of the overall plan for getting back to balance does require people, I think, to dig into their pockets a little bit for certain public services, and post-secondary education is one of the ones that the UCP has picked.
Now, I have some relatives who are on, I guess, long-term disability. They can't work because of injuries. They're on AISH. How will they be impacted by this budget, Tyler?
Well, this has been, I would say, probably the single most controversial thing that has happened in this budget. Part of the plan to save money is by doing something called de-indexing, which basically you have a host of government things that increase by inflation each year. So AISH payments are one of those things. So by de-indexing them, basically the monthly payment that an AISH recipient gets, in November 2019 is going to be the same in November 2020. So there won't be any increase keeping pace with inflation. The number's not going down, of course, so it's not a cut per se. It's just not going up. And as everyone knows, these are not huge sums of money to begin with. So there has been an awful lot of criticism from the New Democrats, specifically directed at this.
Now, speaking of de-indexing, income taxes will also be de-indexed. What does that mean when it comes to filling out my taxes? Will I receive the same amount of money?
Yeah, so you'll receive the same amount of money for the next however many years the income inflation is not happening. So this was a thing in Ottawa over the years. It's been done in other provinces, many other states in the United States, in order to keep money in government pockets. So the gist of it is that every Albertan doesn't pay taxes on about 19,000 and some dollars each year. Now that also goes up by the cost of inflation annually. So if your income stays the same year over year and it goes up by inflation, you're getting a little bit more back from the government to pay for your household bills that have gone up by 2-3%, whatever inflation might be. So the government is now keeping it flat, so your return will be the same number for the coming years, but it will not be going up with inflation. So critics, of course, saying this is a backdoor tax hike. The UCP says, no, that's not the case. People are still getting the same number back. But it's worth about $600 million to them by the end of the next 4 years. So again, voters can make their calculation whether or not they believe that's a tax cut. But that's basically how it's going to work. It's all complicated sounding, but the Coles Notes version is your return is just going to stay the same for the next few years.
Now, the new budget also has news for RV owners and those of us who have driver's licenses.
Yes, indeed. There were a whole host of fee increases in the budget. Driver's license re-registrations, if you need a trailer plate or an RV plate, things like that. Registry services of various kinds. Now, we're not talking enormous increases. We're talking $10, we're talking $20 over the next couple of years, kind of thing. But when you're trying to earn a little bit of extra money here, as the UCP is, as the government is, I should say, this is one way to do it. And like I said earlier, it's a matter of Albertans digging a little bit deeper to pay for services they get and help slay the deficit.
Now, we recently had a clip of Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips attacking Premier Jason Kenney at the Ledge, demanding that Finance Minister Travis Taves be fired. She just said the Finance Minister. So Premier Kenney shot back with, yeah, he was fired last April, referring obviously to the NDP Finance Minister Joe Ceci. Now, tensions are also running high between Notley and Kenney in Edmonton, and Jason Nixon is even in on it. Tell me more about that.
Oh goodness, it has been a rowdy session at the legislature for the last little while. I haven't been around for the past 20 years. Maybe it's been like this forever, but I was in Ottawa for a long time, and this feels crazier than that ever was. Jason Nixon was talking about the NDP being beholden to their socialist overlords in the lead up to the federal election. Rachel Notley has called the AISH de-indexing penny pinching. The tone has been very, very angry down at the legislature. And I was listening to it today, and people are they're yelling at each other, and Kenney's saying, "Oh, you were fired," and the NDP is saying you're hurting people, and it's just, it's politics is theater certainly, but it's gosh, you hope these people aren't walking down the same hallways to get to their offices.
But you know, it's funny. I mean, it's pretty tame compared to what we see sometimes in the UK, all the screaming, and in Russia, where they're picking up chairs, throwing them, and they're getting into fisticuffs. So maybe we should count our blessings. It's a little more tame there. Now, let's talk a bit about Bill 21, which allows the government to replace some striking essential workers in the event of a strike. It also allows health ministers to tell doctors where they can and cannot practice.
Yeah, odd little detail in that, eh? I was reading a little bit about it, and the striking workers thing basically allows replacement workers to come in for essential services. Not super abnormal, I don't think. Um, but when the UCP is going to be entering into what are surely going to be, let's say, tense wage negotiations over the next little while, I think that bill is probably going to get a decent amount of scrutiny and attention. And as for the doctor thing, well, as viewers in Lethbridge and surrounding areas probably know, finding a doctor in small towns and rural areas is really difficult. So, I no details yet on what this might look like, but in theory, this could be a way to get doctors out to areas that are underserved. There's various ways in theory that other jurisdictions have tried this, saying if you go work in a small town or something, the government will pay for part of your student loan or something like that. So whether or not there is a carrot attached to this stick, I couldn't say, but it's certainly an interesting idea, and I can't imagine doctors will be super happy. But then again, they're important, so maybe they do need to go where they're told. I don't know.
Hey, Tyler's Premier Kenney talked much more about the federal carbon tax, which will be implemented in Alberta in January, and the court
Well,
challenge.
not yes. So the court challenge is going to be continued, he says. The government has been releasing details about the TIER program, which is its industrial emissions program. And I have not followed that super closely, but the one detail that did come out this week that was quite important was the tax on industrial emitters in the TIER program is going to be $30 a ton. So the UCP during the election, when they unveiled the sort of initial TIER plan, said it was going to be $20 a ton. So it's a little bit higher than they had planned, and that actually brings it in line with the federal industrial emission standards. So because there's two carbon taxes, right? There's the industrial one, and then there's the personal one. So the UCP is hoping that this TIER program is going to be good enough to keep away the federal industrial carbon tax. And as you say, still going to be fighting the personal carbon tax in court. Whether or not that works is anyone's guess. And at the end of the day, going back to our discussion about taxes next year, Albertans will be able to file for that federal carbon tax rebate.
Now, we talked about the infighting between Notley and Kenney going back and forth all the time. Makes for some colorful times at the ledge. But one thing they can agree on is Bill C-69 and C-48, correct?
That is right. The ever controversial, what does Kenney call it? The tanker ban and the No More Pipelines bill. Those are forever going to be a point of agreement among Notley and Kenney. And it's an odd thing, isn't it, that for all the discontent, the two leaders do agree very fundamentally on the end game in a lot of these political issues circulating in Alberta right now. It's just that they really disagree on how to get there. Can anything be done on those? I'm not sure. I mean, you could have a court challenge. You could holler about it, but I think for Kenney's government, they had pinned a lot of hopes on Andrew Scheer forming the next government, and because that for them, I think, was the simplest way of getting what they want, what many Albertans want.
Has Premier Kenney also addressed Wexit? Alberta's separation seems to be at its highest point right now. Wexit has over 165,000 members.
Yeah, he has actually. So this came up in the immediate aftermath of the election. He spoke with reporters extensively that day, and what he said basically was threefold. He said, "I'm a federalist. I love Canada. I have an emotional attachment to it. I'll have nothing to do with this." Secondly, he said it's Justin Trudeau that's making people feel unwelcome, and he needs to bridge that divide in some way. He's not going to push me out of my own country. And lastly, he said that there's no better way to keep Alberta oil in the ground forever than by leaving the country, because as everyone knows, once we're Alberta to leave, well, where are we going to send our oil? We don't have a coastline. We don't have enough pipelines. So as it stands, Jason Kenney doesn't believe that that would help at all. So he, in many ways, I think, has a lot of the power to control this level of angst that, as you say, is at quite a high right now, probably the highest point since the early 1980s. Maybe the post-Mulrooney years were higher, but at any rate, he is benefiting, I think, in large part from the frustration that Albertans feel, as he would. He rode this sort of wave of discontent into the Premier's office. So to what extent he is able to tamp down on this, or whether or not he lets it fester, I think is a little bit of the open question. He's a very savvy politician. I don't totally see this blowing back in his face, but I think one can see a scenario when this narrative that currently benefits the Conservatives gets a little bit out of hand. And I mean, I know I'm droning on here about the Wexit thing, but I've been working on a story about it for quite a number of days now. And the Wexit thing is still pretty fringe. I mean, there's a lot of people in the Facebook groups, but if you look at the election numbers from in the spring, you had like 13,000 people that voted for the Alberta Independence Party. That's less than pretty much, well, it's less than almost everyone. These are not colossal numbers of people who are willing to properly stick their neck out for the issue.
Hey, you know what? Maybe not a referendum on separation, but perhaps a referendum on equalization payments. We'll talk about that another time. Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton once again. Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks, Al.